I'm Cassandra Miller, 35 years old, and for most of my adult life, I believed hard work could protect the people I loved from the randomness of loss. I was wrong. The night my husband disappeared into the ocean off Cape Cod during a sailing trip was the night our neatly built world began to come apart. He never made it home that night, only his boat did, and suddenly it was just me and Ethan staring down a future that no longer made sense. I rebuilt, because that's what you do when you're a mother and you have no choice. I thought the worst had already happened, but I hadn't yet learned what betrayal really looked like before I go any further. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from, and don't forget to like and subscribe. If you've ever had to stand strong when your world collapsed, I grew up in a modest home in Rhode Island, the older of 2 girls. Our parents, Martha and William, raised us to value manners over ambition and tradition over questioning. I was the one who did question things: why a girl couldn't choose finance over family science, why a woman had to wait on others to take the lead. My sister Jillian, 2 years younger, fit more easily into our parents' world. Cheer captain married straight out of college, always praised for being sweet, while I was told I thought too much of myself. Still, I tried to be close even when the compliments leaned her way and the critiques landed on me. After grad school, I moved to Boston and clawed my way up the ladder at a firm called Harber & Beckett, where very few women ever made it past middle management. I did. I was 28 when I met Michael, a client with quiet eyes and a habit of listening more than he talked. He built things with his hands for a living, buildings and bridges and blueprints most people never even noticed. We married quietly the next year and bought a colonial fixer-upper outside the city, the kind with creaky steps and room for dreams. Michael painted Ethan's nursery himself with a ceiling of hand-stenciled stars that glowed in the dark. He'll never go to sleep without a sky. He said his fingers still streaked with navy blue when he pulled me into a hug. Ethan arrived 2 years into our marriage, all lungs and laughter. For a while, everything felt balanced. Michael handled mornings, I did evenings, and on weekends we were just a family of 3 with waffles and sidewalk chalk. Until one Sunday in early spring, Michael took a colleague out for a quick sail along the coast, something he'd done a dozen times before. A sudden weather shift, a call from the Coast Guard, and then the silence that follows when hope runs out. The other man survived. Michael didn't. That first year after I moved through life like a woman underwater. Ethan, only 5, then kept asking when Daddy was coming home. I kept telling him he couldn't, not because he didn't want to, but because heaven doesn't give rain checks. My family came around more, dropping off casseroles and staying just long enough to say they'd helped. Patrick, Michael's brother, started coming by too with his wife Heather, bringing dinner and stories about Michael that always made Ethan smile. Jillian offered to take Ethan some weekends so I could rest, and my parents even stayed for a while, insisting we reestablish structure. I let them. At the time, I needed hands. I didn't yet see the cracks beneath the kindness. Patrick had always been in Michael's shadow. His business ventures never stuck, though he talked big about owning something soon. Heather resented the comparison between their apartment and my home, even if I never made it out loud. Jillian and Greg struggled financially, though you'd never guess it from their designer handbags and leased SUVs. And my parents, they'd retired with less than they expected, having banked on their house appreciating more than it did. Still, we played the part. Birthdays, holidays, even Sunday dinners I hosted, and they came. They made small remarks, little digs about how lucky I was or how easy money came when you worked with numbers. I ignored most of it. I had a son to raise, and I didn't have time for bitterness. Then Ethan got sick. One minute he was laughing on the school playground. The next, my phone was lighting up with urgent calls. By the time I got to the ER, he was unconscious and burning with fever. Doctors murmured about inflammation organs failing, a rare autoimmune condition I couldn't even pronounce. I sat there in a plastic chair beside a bed full of tubes, unable to breathe, while nurses wheeled him into ICU. I thought I had already lost everything that mattered. I didn't know yet that the people I loved most were already making plans behind my back. Plans that would leave me with nothing but a dying child and an empty bank account. When Ethan's diagnosis was confirmed, my world narrowed to the size of his hospital room. I slept in a narrow recliner next to his bed, waking every time the monitors beeped or a nurse came in to check his vitals. Dr. Winters was clear his condition was rare and aggressive, and every hour mattered. There were moments when he'd wake up and try to smile, his face pale and puffy from the steroids, and I'd force a smile back like nothing was wrong. But the truth was, every day felt like it carried more weight than the last. My team at Harbor and Beckett took over most of my workload, and I stepped away from the firm indefinitely. I kept a small laptop in the corner of Ethan's room to handle what I couldn't delegate, but my focus stayed on him. My family visited often in those first weeks. Patrick and Heather brought meals from our favorite spots around town, and Jillian took over handling mail and keeping my house in order. My parents split their time between sitting with Ethan and running small errands. They said things like, "You need your strength, and let us take care of this." And for a while, I believed them. I thought maybe this would bring us closer. One evening, after a long meeting with Dr. Winters about a possible new treatment, I shared everything with my family over takeout in the corner of Ethan's room. The clinical trial came with promise, but it was still experimental, and insurance wouldn't cover it. The total cost would land somewhere around $430,000. I had savings, a well-managed investment portfolio, and an emergency fund Michael had helped me build after Ethan was born. It would be enough, but just barely. Patrick gave a low whistle when I said the number. "That's a lot of money for something they're not even guaranteeing," he said. "It's Ethan's best shot," I said, my voice steady. Jillian nodded and reached for my hand. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said. "Let me help with the bills. Just give me access to your banking so I can keep everything current while you focus on him." Patrick added that he could check in on the house more often, bring in the mail, water the plants, make sure nothing happened while I was gone. My parents offered to help with hospital visits so I could get some sleep in a real bed every now and then. I didn't argue. I was exhausted. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't carrying the weight alone. I set up a limited login for Jillian on my online banking, just enough to pay the utilities and mortgage, and gave Patrick a spare key and the alarm code. I created a calendar for my parents to visit, alternating between morning and evening hours. Then I turned my full attention back to Ethan. Days passed in a rhythm that didn't leave much room to think. Labs every morning, updates from the care team, endless rounds of medications and fluid checks. Maya, one of the nurses, reminded me to eat when I forgot. Dr. Winters met with me every few days to walk me through next steps. Ethan's color faded more with each passing week, and I filled the quiet with books and soft music, telling him stories about the stars on his nursery ceiling and the camping trip we'd take when he got better. It wasn't until the third week in ICU that I noticed a shift. My family stopped showing up as often. Text messages went unanswered for long stretches. When they did reply, their messages were short, distracted, always followed by a vague excuse. Patrick said he had meetings. Jillian claimed her kids were sick. My parents started canceling their visits. I assumed they were just tired. Watching a child fight to stay alive isn't easy for anyone. Then Maya mentioned seeing Patrick in the hospital parking lot, arguing loudly on the phone. He looked upset, she said, as she adjusted Ethan's monitor. "Everything okay with him?" I meant to ask, but that night Ethan spiked a fever so suddenly that 5 nurses rushed into the room. I sat frozen, gripping the arm of the chair while they adjusted his oxygen and started new medications. Dr. Winters moved quickly and calmly, but I could tell it was serious. We didn't talk about Patrick again. Later that week, we got the news we'd been hoping for. Ethan was officially accepted into the clinical trial, and the hospital could begin the process as soon as the initial payment was made. The specialized meds needed to be ordered, and the stem cell harvesting team had to be scheduled in advance. Dr. Winters explained that timing was critical, and any delays could jeopardize his place in the program. That night, while Ethan finally slept through the pain thanks to a medication change, I stepped out into the hallway to call my financial advisor. Reception was bad in Ethan's room, so I walked to the waiting area. I passed the chapel and saw a couple holding on to each other in silence. Their grief sat heavy in the air, and I felt that quiet weight settle into my bones. I told myself I was doing everything right. The money was in place, the team was ready, and Ethan had a shot. I didn't know that back home the safety net I had spent years building was being pulled out from under me. The next day was long. Ethan had his first preliminary procedure to prepare for the cell harvesting. I sat with him for hours reading aloud while he drifted in and out of sleep. At one point he looked up and asked if I would stay with him the whole time. Every second, I told him. It wasn't until close to midnight after he had fallen asleep that I remembered the bank notifications. My phone had buzzed repeatedly during the day, but I'd silenced it without checking. I assumed they were reminders or alerts confirming the transfers I had scheduled. Still curled in the recliner, I opened the app to check. The numbers didn't make sense. My checking account, which should have had over $50,000 set aside for hospital payments, now showed less than $2,000. My savings account, down from nearly $150,000, read $812. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, and pulled up the investment account. What was supposed to be over $300,000 had dwindled to just under $20,000. Altogether, nearly $500,000 had vanished. I couldn't breathe. The phone nearly fell from my hands. Nurse Maya noticed from the hallway and came rushing in. Cassandra. What is it? I held out the phone, unable to speak. She looked at the screen, then back at me. Is this real? I nodded. The money for Ethan's treatment. It's gone. Maya led me to the parents' lounge and brought me water. I'll keep an eye on him, she said. Just focus on figuring this out. The next 2 hours blurred. I called the bank's emergency line. They confirmed several large transfers made in the last 5 days. Each had gone to accounts registered to Patrick Heather, Jillian Gregg, and my parents. They were authorized with your credentials, the investigator said. From your home IP address, devices previously used to log in. I told her I hadn't been home in weeks. Then it hit me. The access, the trust, the passwords and keys I had handed over. They hadn't been helping. They had been planning. I ended the call with my hands shaking, filed the initial fraud reports, and froze the remaining accounts. Then, needing something to ground myself, I checked their social media pages. I didn't have to scroll far. Patrick had posted a picture of a new luxury SUV, leveling up Life's Too Short. Heather showed off high-end shopping bags with a caption about treating herself. My parents were apparently on a surprise European anniversary trip. Jillian wore a diamond bracelet I had never seen before. They hadn't waited. They weren't hiding. They had stolen Ethan's future and were celebrating it. I sat on the cold tile floor of the hospital bathroom and wept so hard I could barely breathe. I stayed curled on the bathroom floor longer than I realized, the cold tile numbing my legs while my thoughts ran in circles. Eventually, Maya came to find me. She didn't ask questions. She just helped me stand, steadied me at the sink while I washed my face and walked me back to Ethan's room. He was still asleep, the soft rise and fall of his chest a rhythm I clung to. I sat down beside him, held his hand, and promised quietly that I wouldn't let this be the end. Not for him, not for us. Once I was sure he was stable, I made 2 calls. The first was to the hospital's financial services department. I explained that the payment for the trial had been interrupted, asked for time to resolve the situation, and begged them not to release Ethan's place in the program. The second call was to the police. It took all the strength I had to say the words out loud. My family stole from me, from my son. By morning, Ethan's blood work showed a small improvement. Dr. Winters called it modest progress, but it was the first sign we'd had in weeks that things might be moving in the right direction. That small shift in his numbers gave me what I needed. If he was fighting, then I would too. 3 days later, Maya offered to stay with Ethan for the afternoon. She said they'd watch movies and told me not to worry. "Go do what you need to do," she said gently. "He'll be just fine." I kissed Ethan's forehead, tucked his blanket under his arms, and walked out of the hospital for the first time in nearly a month. The sunlight felt strange on my skin, almost too bright after so many days under fluorescent lights. I drove straight to Jillian's house. It was Sunday, and I knew they'd be there. They always were. The driveway was crowded. I recognized Patrick's new SUV immediately. My parents' car sat next to it. A third car I didn't recognize, likely another new purchase, took up the last spot near the curb. I parked a block away and walked around to the back of the house past the trimmed hedges and the sliding glass doors that opened onto the deck. They were all inside, gathered in the kitchen. Shopping bags covered the counters. Champagne glasses clinked. Laughter carried through the open patio door. I stayed out of sight behind one of Jillian's oversized planters and listened. Patrick's voice was loud. "Put the deposit down this morning, Bali, 3 weeks. Can't wait to leave all this stress behind." Greg laughed. "You get those Malibu listings I sent. That one with the dock looked perfect." "Let's not get carried away," my father said, though he was smiling. "Pace yourselves." Jillian held up her arm, showing off a bracelet. "Cassandra hasn't noticed a thing. By the time she does, we'll be long gone." "She's not going anywhere," Greg said. "She's stuck at that hospital. I didn't hear anything else." I turned and walked around to the front of the house and rang the bell. Greg answered, his expression shifting from surprise to annoyance. "You again?" He stepped aside. "Come on in." I walked into the living room. They were still holding their drinks. No one moved. Jillian was the first to speak. "Cassandra," she said lightly, "is Ethan okay?" "Don't," I said. "Don't pretend." Patrick set down his glass. "You look tired. Want a seat? Something to drink." "Where is my money?" I asked. No one answered. My father cleared his throat. "What money?" I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app. "The $500,000 you all took. I know every transfer. I've spoken to the bank." Jillian stepped forward. "I was only paying bills. Maybe the app glitched. There's probably a mistake." I looked around the room at the bags, the jewelry, the cars in the driveway. "You've been spending it." Patrick shrugged. "Fine. Yes, we took it, and we needed it more than you did." My mouth went dry. "What did you just say?" He stepped closer. "You've always had everything, Cassandra. The career, the house, the husband. Meanwhile, we're struggling. I've got a failing business. Jillian and Greg are behind on the mortgage. Mom and Dad barely have anything left for retirement. So you stole from my son." "We borrowed what the family needed," my mother said quietly. "Spending all that money on something that might not work. Michael wouldn't have wanted that." I stared at her. "You don't get to use his name." Greg raised his voice. "It would have been our inheritance anyway. We just took it early." "You've always rubbed your success in our faces," Jillian added. "Always acting better than us." I stood still for a moment, letting it all settle. Then I said, "Return it. All of it. By tomorrow morning." Patrick laughed. Or what, I didn't answer. My father stepped forward. "You gave them access. Your passwords. Your key. You really think a court will see that as theft?" "You should be focused on Ethan," my mother said. whatever time he has left. I took a breath. This is your last chance. Patrick smirked. Go ahead. Call the police. They'll say it's a family matter. I turned and walked out. Their laughter followed me all the way to the car. Back at the hospital, Ethan was watching a movie with Maya. Jurassic Park, he said, grinning. Maya says the dinosaurs are all wrong, but I like them anyway. I kissed the top of his head. They're perfect. Maya met my eyes. Everything okay? It will be, I said. That night after Ethan fell asleep, I opened my laptop. I pulled up my old college roommate's number. Jessica Harrington had gone into law last I heard. She worked for the DA's office now. When she answered, I told her everything. They used your credentials while your son was in ICU, she said. That's wire fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy. They think I won't fight back, I told her. They're wrong, she replied. We made a list, bank statements, screenshots, messages, everything I had. I stayed up compiling it all step by step. As the sun came up, I sent it to her. Ethan stirred in his sleep, rolled toward me, and murmured something I couldn't quite hear. I stood and tucked his blanket higher around his shoulders. The monitors beeped steadily beside him, and the first light of morning stretched across the floor. Jessica called me back just before sunrise. She'd already spoken to a contact in the Financial Crimes Division, and they were reviewing the documentation I'd sent. This is more than enough to open an investigation, she told me. You're not alone in this, Cass. Her voice had the kind of calm I remembered from college, measured firm, and always 5 steps ahead. By mid-morning, I was sitting across from Detective Marcus Ryan in a quiet room just off the hospital's family lounge. He wore a gray sport coat and carried a leather binder tucked under his arm. His handshake was steady, his eyes sharp. He didn't flinch once as I went over every detail. I showed him the account transfers, the login logs, the purchase receipts I'd traced through email notifications, and the screenshots from Patrick and Jillian's public posts. This is one of the clearest trails I've seen in a while, he said after reviewing the evidence. The number of people involved, the timing, the vulnerability of your son, it checks every box for felony prosecution. He asked if I was willing to testify. I said yes without hesitation. Before he left, he explained the next steps. They would start with freezing assets, anything still in those accounts, plus recent high-value purchases, and pursue emergency court orders to prevent the sale or transfer of property. With your permission, he added, we'll also coordinate with the hospital legal team so Ethan's care doesn't suffer while the investigation moves forward. That afternoon, I received an email from Amanda, my cousin on my mother's side. We hadn't spoken much since high school, but she had been at Jillian's house the day I confronted them. Her message was short. Cass, I'm so sorry. I didn't know what they were doing until it was too late, but I saw the texts. They've been planning this for months. I'm forwarding everything now. There were dozens of screenshots attached. Group messages between Patrick, Heather, Jillian, and my parents. They talked about waiting until I was distracted, joked about how long it would take me to notice, even argued over how to divide the money once it was gone. One message from Patrick read, she'll be too wrapped up in the hospital to do anything. Will be long gone before she figures it out. I forwarded everything to Jessica and to Detective Ryan. By that evening, I had a call from the hospital's legal department. They connected me with Eleanor Walsh, an attorney who specialized in emergency injunctions. The case is strong, she said after reviewing the documents. And more importantly, the purpose of the funds was specific life-saving treatment for a minor. That will carry significant weight with the court. We filed that night. Eleanor requested an emergency hearing first thing in the morning. The next day, we received the court's approval to freeze all known accounts held by my family members. Another order barred them from selling or transferring anything purchased within the last 30 days. That included vehicles, jewelry, electronics, and possibly travel bookings. Later that day, Dr. Winters came into Ethan's room during rounds. We've reviewed the situation, she said gently. Given the documentation and the hospital's policy on pediatric care, we're going to move forward with the clinical trial. Payment can be arranged once the legal situation is resolved. Maya was standing behind her arms, folded, nodding along. "We're not letting red tape keep this boy from getting what he needs," she said. It was the first time in weeks that I felt something other than dread. I sat with Ethan that night, reading aloud from the book we'd started before his fever had spiked. His hands were still small in mine, but his color looked better. He slept deeper. The machines were quieter. That night I slept in the recliner and actually stayed asleep. The following morning I got another call from Detective Ryan. "We've recovered about 60% of the stolen funds so far," he said. "Between the frozen accounts and pending seizures, we expect to recover most of the assets. We also have enough evidence to issue arrest warrants. But before we move forward, I wanted to check with you." I leaned back in the chair beside Ethan's bed. "What does that mean?" "I mean we can proceed right away. Or if you'd prefer, we can give you a little time to confront them again. You deserve that choice." I looked over at Ethan. His cheeks were flushed pink for the first time in weeks, and he was quietly building a Lego castle on his tray table. "They'll all be at Jillian's house again Sunday evening," I said. "I'll be there at 7. Jessica helped coordinate the details with Ryan and the district attorney's office. The plan was simple. I would walk in one more time, give them a final opportunity to make it right, and walk out with my head high, whether they gave it back or not. Saturday passed quietly. Ethan's numbers continued to improve. Dr. Winters said his lungs were showing signs of reduced inflammation. Maya let him pick the movie that night and brought in popsicles she kept hidden in the nurse's freezer. "Don't tell anyone," she whispered as she handed him one, and he giggled for the first time in weeks. The next morning he woke up hungry. "Can I have pancakes?" he asked, and I almost laughed from the sound of it. We settled on toast and pudding instead, but it felt like a celebration anyway. Dr. Winters came by to check on him and raised her eyebrows at the empty plate. "He's turning a corner," she said. I spent the afternoon organizing my documents one last time, checking the timestamps and screenshots and making sure my phone was fully charged. Jessica called to go over what to say if things got tense. Detective Ryan confirmed that officers would be in place by 6:30, staged nearby but out of sight. I told Maya I'd be back before Ethan's bedtime. "Take your time," she said. "We'll be right here." I kissed Ethan's forehead and promised to bring back a surprise. At exactly 7 o'clock, I pulled into Jillian's neighborhood. Patrick's SUV was parked at an angle in the driveway. The house looked the same, porch lights, glowing music spilling out through half-open windows. I sat in the car for a moment, watching the silhouettes move around inside. They didn't know it yet, but this time, I wasn't walking in alone. I parked at the edge of the driveway just behind Patrick's Mercedes and turned off the engine. From the street, I could see the kitchen windows, glowing shadows moving behind the curtains. Music played low, a steady beat pulsing through the walls. I stepped out, smoothed my jacket, and walked up the front steps without hesitation. Greg opened the door. He looked surprised for a second, then leaned against the frame with that familiar smirk. "You again," he said. "You really should get a hobby." He stepped aside and I walked past him into the living room. Everyone else was there. Jillian on the couch, swirling a glass of wine. Patrick at the kitchen island, stacking papers. My parents at the dining table, flipping through what looked like travel brochures. Heather sat with her feet up a tablet in her lap. They all looked up as I entered. Not one of them stood. Jillian raised an eyebrow. "Cassandra, I wasn't expecting you. I figured as much." Patrick closed a folder and leaned against the counter. "Everything okay at the hospital?" "I didn't come to talk about Ethan," I said. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and opened the file with the account summary. "I came to talk about the $500,000 you stole. You have one last chance to return it." My father sighed and set his papers down. "We've been through this." My mother chimed in. "You gave Jillian access to your account. Remember?" Jillian crossed her legs, still holding her wine. "You said I could pay the bills. Maybe the bank mixed something up. I have the transfer records, I said. Time-stamped, IP tracked, linked to your devices. This isn't a mistake. Patrick gave a quiet laugh. And what exactly do you plan to do about it? I didn't answer right away. I glanced around the room at the open boxes, the luggage near the stairs, and a pile of new shopping bags on the floor. Airline tickets sat in plain view on the table, first class to Bali. Departure next week. You're still spending what doesn't belong to you, I said, even now. Heather finally looked up from her tablet. You act like we robbed a bank. It's family money. It was Ethan's treatment money, I said. And you knew that. Greg scoffed. We've been scraping by for years while you built your empire. All we did was take our share early. You didn't ask, I said. You didn't tell me. You planned it while my son was in intensive care. Patrick stepped closer, his voice low and sharp. You're making this a lot more dramatic than it needs to be. If you want some money back, maybe we can work something out. But this storming in, throwing accusations, it's not going to get you anywhere. I didn't look away. Return the money, every penny. He shook his head slowly. There's nothing you can do. I've already spoken to the police, I said. And the DA's office. They know everything. A flicker of panic passed through Jillian's expression. You're bluffing. They've already filed the charges. Your accounts are frozen. The cars, the jewelry, they're flagged. You don't know it yet, but this is already over. Heather stood. This is insane. Patrick's voice rose. You're not thinking clearly. Your kid is sick and you're wasting time playing detective. For what? For his future, I said. Silence stretched across the room. Then I pulled out my phone and tapped one message. Now. 3 seconds later, the front door crashed open with such force the walls shook. Officers flooded the hallway, firm voices echoing down the corridor. Police, stay where you are. Patrick backed up a step. Jillian dropped her glass, the stem snapping as it hit the floor. My mother clutched my father's arm. Heather froze. Detective Ryan entered behind them holding a folder and a badge. We have warrants for Patrick Miller, Heather Miller, Jillian Cooper, Gregory Cooper, Martha Winters, and William Winters. Patrick raised his hands. There's a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Ryan said, flipping open the folder. Wire fraud. Conspiracy. Theft from an account designated for the medical care of a dependent minor. Officers stepped in with practiced calm. Greg cursed under his breath as one of them secured his wrists. Jillian stared at me, stunned. You set us up. I shook my head. You set yourselves up. Patrick bolted toward the back door. 2 officers were already waiting. He barely made it onto the porch before they tackled him. My mother started crying loudly, insisting she didn't know what was happening. My father said something about shared assets, that it wasn't really theft. Detective Ryan replied without raising his voice. The texts, the transfers, the purchases, all documented. You knew what you were doing. One by one, they were escorted outside. I stood in the same spot where I had confronted them the first time, the room now filled with officers tagging items and photographing receipts. I picked up the airline tickets from the table, scanned the names, and set them down. Near the fireplace, there was a framed photo of Ethan taken at his last birthday. He had frosting on his cheek and a sparkler in his hand. I slid it out of the frame, tucked it in my coat, and walked out the door. Detective Ryan caught up to me at the car. We'll finish processing everything today. We've already recovered close to $300,000. With asset liquidation and insurance reimbursement, you should be able to recover most of it. I nodded. That's enough for now. He nodded back. We'll take your statement tomorrow at the hospital if that works. It does, I said. I drove back to the hospital just as the sun was starting to set. Outside Ethan's window, the sky was streaked with pale orange. Maya waved when I walked in. He's been asking for you, said you promised him a surprise. "I brought it," I said, holding up the photo in its bent frame. She smiled. "He'll love that." I stepped into Ethan's room and saw him sitting up, blanket pulled to his chest, eyes bright with curiosity. "Mom," he said, grinning. "Did you get them?" I sat beside him. "Yes," I said. "I did." Detective Ryan met me outside the hospital the next morning with a folder tucked under his arm and a black coffee in his hand. He said the formal statement would take about an hour and that we could sit somewhere quiet. The hospital's legal liaison had arranged a small conference room down the hall from the ICU one with a window facing the courtyard. I followed him inside, closing the door gently behind us. He reviewed the report slowly, checking each detail against my timeline. We went over the transfers, the screenshots, the social media posts. The paper trail had stayed clean, almost too clean, which made the coordinated nature of it all even more damning. He paused over the message from Patrick about waiting until she's too busy to notice. "This," he said, tapping the page, "is going to carry weight." Jessica called in halfway through the meeting to confirm that the DA's office was moving forward with formal charges against all 6 individuals. Given the amount and the target, she said we'll also request enhanced sentencing under financial abuse of a dependent. I thanked her and ended the call with the kind of breath I hadn't taken in weeks. The hospital's billing office sent over a revised plan later that afternoon. With the recovered funds and the insurance policy's fraud clause, most of the clinical trial costs would be fully covered. Winters dropped by just before evening rounds to share Ethan's latest test results. "Inflammation markers are down another 4%, she said, smiling. "His kidneys are stable. The medication's working." Maya clapped once and whispered, "Yes," loud enough for Ethan to hear, which made him grin. The next week moved in slow, steady stretches. Ethan's appetite came back one small request at a time. First toast, then scrambled eggs, then a bite of the hospital's mashed potatoes, which he declared not as bad as before. His hair had started thinning, a side effect we knew to expect, but he didn't seem to mind. I brought stickers and let him decorate his IV stand with dinosaurs and stars. Meanwhile, the court proceedings began behind the scenes. Patrick and Greg were held without bail pending trial. Jillian and Heather were released under supervision, required to check in daily and surrender their passports. My parents surprisingly had hired a separate attorney and requested a private hearing to negotiate a plea deal. Detective Ryan said they'd likely avoid jail time, but would be held responsible for restitution through asset seizure and garnished retirement benefits. The shock of it all hadn't worn off. I kept expecting to feel something stronger, anger, bitterness, maybe even relief. But what I felt most was quiet. The noise they used to take up in my life had vanished. What remained was a kind of stillness that let me hear Ethan's voice more clearly, watch his smile return in fragments. One afternoon while Ethan napped, I stepped into the lounge to return a call from our estate attorney. After Michael's death, I'd updated all our documents, including the trust Ethan would receive once he turned 25. I hadn't expected to hear from the attorney again so soon. Given what's happened, she said you may want to update your guardianship instructions. I noticed your sister and your parents are still listed as secondary caretakers. I sat there for a moment, phone pressed to my ear, realizing just how deeply I'd trusted people who saw Ethan as a means to an end. "Yes," I said, "let's remove them completely." After the call, I walked back toward the ICU. Maya stood outside Ethan's room, arms folded, watching the monitors through the glass. "He's been sleeping more," she said. "That's a good sign." I nodded. "He's starting to dream again. Last night he told me he was flying a plane with Michael in the cockpit." Maya smiled gently, then his heart still remembering the safe places. Later that night, I opened the envelope Jessica had sent me. Inside were copies of the full court filings, each charge, each documented exchange, each signature. The case had grown stronger with Amanda's forwarded messages, and with the new asset tracing software they'd used, the final recovery estimate now sat at just over $400,000, enough to finish Ethan's treatment, cover his follow-up care, and rebuild a new emergency fund from the ground up. I tucked the envelope into the drawer beneath my laptop and turned back to Ethan's bed. He was watching a cartoon, quietly, arms curled around his stuffed bear, one of the few things he'd kept from home. I sat beside him and asked if he wanted to draw something before lights out. He nodded and reached for the pad. When he was done, he held it up with both hands. A house with stars on the roof, 2 stick figures out front, one tall, one small, and a little sign that said, "New Place." "Is that us?" I asked. He nodded. "It's where we go next." I tucked the picture into the folder beside my chair, then reached for his blanket. "We'll get there," I said, one step at a time. Ethan was released from the hospital 4 weeks after the clinical trial began, Dr. Winters didn't call it a full recovery. She used words like remission and close monitoring, but when she smiled and signed the discharge papers, I could finally breathe again. Maya wheeled him out through the front doors with a balloon tied to his chair and a lopsided cupcake in a plastic container. Only half the sugar, she whispered to me as Ethan peeled back the lid. "But don't tell him that." We moved into a rental house in a different part of town. Smaller, simpler, but clean and full of light. Ethan picked the room with the corner windows, and I let him place his glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling one by one. The first night there, he fell asleep with the lights on and his stuffed bear tucked under one arm. I sat in the hallway for a long time just listening to the stillness. The legal cases moved faster than I expected. Jessica called one morning to say that both Patrick and Greg had accepted plea deals. 5 years each, no early release restitution included. Jillian and Heather pleaded out separately, avoiding prison, but receiving lengthy probation and full financial penalties. My parents' attorney negotiated a lesser sentence, no jail time, but they forfeited the house, their savings, and any future claims on my estate. In the end, we recovered a little over $400,000. It was enough to pay off the remaining treatment bills, fund follow-up care, and rebuild the emergency account. I never thought I'd have to touch again. I kept a detailed record of every recovered cent. Not because I needed to prove anything to them, but because I needed to prove it to myself. I returned to work part-time that fall. My firm had held my position and welcomed me back with quiet grace. The office felt smaller somehow, or maybe I had just grown. I no longer stayed late unless I had to. I no longer let silence fill every spare moment. I worked when I was needed, then went home to my son. We built a new rhythm. Ethan returned to school gradually, half days at first, then full weeks by winter. His classmates welcomed him back with hand-drawn cards and awkward hugs. His teacher, Mrs. Dorsey, sent home weekly notes about his progress and said he still asked about space every chance he got. "I think he's going to be an astronomer," she said one afternoon at pickup. "Or a pilot, or both." The people who showed up during the hardest days didn't disappear once the crisis passed. Jessica became Ethan's godmother officially that December. She brought science kits and hardcover books, quizzed him on constellations, and stayed late when I needed help filling out new paperwork. Maya stopped by once a week with banana muffins and hospital gossip, and she always asked Ethan if he was drinking enough water. "You know I can tell when you lie," she warned, wagging her finger playfully. Dr. Winters came to his birthday party with a stethoscope and a wrapped box of Legos. Detective Ryan installed a new security system himself one Saturday morning, then joined us for grilled cheese and tomato soup in the kitchen. None of them owed us anything, and yet they kept showing up. We took a photo that day, Ethan in the center cheeks, flushed from the wind, with 4 adults circled around him. It sat on our fridge next to the school lunch calendar and the new house rules Ethan had written in marker. Rule No. 1, don't steal. Rule number 2, always have pudding in the fridge. Rule number 3, be nice even when you're mad. One evening, just before bed, Ethan asked why his grandparents hadn't called. I sat beside him, brushing his hair back gently. Sometimes people make choices they can't undo, I said. Like when I broke the window at school and had to use my savings to help fix it, I nodded. Sort of like that, but bigger. He looked thoughtful. Will they come back? I don't know, I said, but the people who are here now, they stayed. That's what matters. He nodded and reached for his blanket. I'm glad we have our people. So am I. That weekend, we hosted a small housewarming dinner, just the 5 of us crowded around the kitchen table. Jessica brought flowers. Maya brought a peach cobbler. Detective Ryan brought a new board game for Ethan and stayed to play the first round. Dr. Winters sat quietly and watched us all, her expression soft, as Ethan explained the rules. After they left, I stood in the doorway for a while, holding a cup of tea, listening to the night. The house was quiet but full. The air didn't feel fragile anymore. Ethan appeared in the hallway, rubbing his eyes. Can I sleep in your room tonight? Just for tonight, I said, stepping aside. He climbed into my bed and curled up beside me. Mom, he whispered. We're going to be okay now, right? We already are, I said. Spring arrived slowly with longer evenings and the faint smell of fresh grass drifting through the open windows. By then, Ethan was running in the yard again, chasing his shadow across the fence line as if nothing had ever touched him. I sat on the porch, coffee warm in my hands, and watched him play. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the next call, the next bill, or the next betrayal. I was just watching my son laugh. The people who stayed, Jessica, Maya, Dr. Winters, Detective Ryan, were no longer just friends or helpers. They had become family in the truest sense. They showed up without being asked, celebrated even the smallest victories, and carried us through the hardest nights. It struck me that sometimes family isn't about blood at all. Sometimes it's about presence, loyalty, and kindness that doesn't keep score. Ethan's school hosted a science fair that May. He built a cardboard solar system, each planet painted with shaky brush strokes and string holding them in orbit. When he stood by his project explaining gravity to anyone who stopped to listen, I could see how far he had come. He wasn't the boy lying in a hospital bed anymore. He was a boy with a future. That night, after the fair, he asked if I thought his grandparents would ever visit. I told him I didn't know, but I reminded him of the people who filled the empty spaces. Look around, I said. We're not missing anything. He nodded slowly, and I think he understood. Life didn't return to what it was before it built into something steadier, stronger. The past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined us. The lies, the theft, the abandonment, they lost their power once we learned who truly stood beside us. I've come to believe that resilience isn't about never falling. It's about rising even when you're unsure if you can, and letting the right hands help lift you up. Justice didn't erase the pain, but it gave us space to heal. And kindness, steady, simple kindness, showed us the way forward. So here we are. Not perfect, not untouched, but whole. If there's one thing I carry from it all, it's this dignity isn't something others can give or take away. It's something we hold on to quietly until the storm passes. And once it does, we discover we were stronger than we ever knew. Thank you for walking through this story with me. If it touched you, I hope you'll share it with someone who might need the reminder that even in the hardest seasons, there can still be light.